So Corona notwithstanding, don't stop. Believe in Charlie.
I was like not going to make a Journey joke. And then you did.
I made it.
And you ruined this whole thing. I'm going to delete it all. So, I'll try to do a little introduction kind of thing.
Okay. I'm ready. Introduce me. Now.
Here's the introduction. David Lewis.
It was an okay introduction. This is pretty good.
Okay. How about this one?
So, no, I think we could just talk. I think that a long time ago, when I was a kid, I was really obsessed with music, and I really cared a lot about music, art, and film. But I realized I was terrible at music, art, and film. Tone deaf, can't dance, can't paint, can't do really anything. But was surrounded by all these creative people in different parts of my life who were really talented, but also not able to advocate for themselves. So I think at some point I realized that my best role was to help people who were creative sort of find a voice. So that was a big part of, certainly when I started booking concerts or putting out records or doing publicity, it was a lot about that. And then later on in my life, it sort of just became about trying to instill those same ideas, but making it more about sort of a DIY sort of approach for artists. So trying to understand that as an educator, that a lot of the things that we were doing in the 90s are actually applicable today. And we just need to stop thinking about the artist and the business person as like separate entities. So it's one thing. And then we have to train both of those things. So it's not just being a great vocalist. It's also how do you build a business? And then how do you understand and navigate all those things? So I think that's kind of my space with music, or has been my space with music.
And some of what we wanted to talk about today is basically the difficulty that so many of us artists kind of feel with that reality. What do the artists do that like they don't want to be a business person? I mean, is it just in like the capitalist world we live in now? Is like everybody a business person? Is that just, if you're a therapist, you're a business person? If you're a painter, you're also a business person? Is this how it always has been, or is this like just this kind of new capitalism on steroids?
I don't know. I mean, I think like it's always, in a way, the musician has always been a hustler, right? And the creative has always sort of had to figure out a way to make it work. And whether or not that was deeply subsidized by some patron of the arts or the government or the capitalistic system or whatever it might be, in and of itself, I think it's always been a factor. But then when we storytell around successful artists, we never talk about that part, right? So we always talk about the sort of great genius undiscovered, all of a sudden is discovered, and then is famous genius that does this stuff. And this is not really kind of sexy or exciting to talk about, like writing your bio or trying to sort of connect with people or network or whatever it might be. So they became kind of dirty words. And the idea of it kind of got romanticized. And I think that's kind of the factor. But if you go back hundreds of years, I think musicians have always sort of had to hustle. And I think that's the same now. And in a way, the world has changed a lot, but I don't know if it has to do with capitalism. If we think about success, instead of success being fame, success being sustainability from all factors, then I think that's entirely achievable today, 10 years ago, 100 years ago. I think it's the fame part that really gets in people's heads.
Yeah. I was just reading this this newsletter from Yancey Strickland from Kickstarter, and he was kind of talking about this like this instant gratification, this individualist me now, not like me future or us now or us future. I don't know how, like, I think so. Sustainability, like, how do you see that? What does that mean for artists now? I think like, I find myself getting so caught up in like the here and like like this moment. So like what I'm working on
Right.
right now, this next thing I do has to be the best thing, or people will kind of like turn me off or something.
I was watching this. I also read this thing from Yancey, and I thought it was pretty interesting and worth talking about. But I also just watched the David Attenborough documentary about his life,
Yeah.
which has a lot to do with sustainability and natural environment and a lot of other stuff. But it's also what I realized, or the thing I took away in 1979, he was 50. And that's really when his career started. Right. So I think that
Yeah.
it's incredible to me that we think about, and we put so much pressure on, and especially as a young person, when you're 17, thinking about TikTok and Instagram and instant gratification. And if we could see the totality of it all, if you could see the whole of it, you would understand you have a lot of time. And then sustainability is about weathering that. So you don't, it's not all at once, right? So it's not 17. Can't be, not everybody is Billie Eilish. And even her career, in a way, everybody at some point wants to become Neil Young, where you're putting out lots of great records over a long period of time. And that should be the focus period. And whether or not those records make money or are massive hits is not the point. And if you interview any of those artists who have had a long career, even Bon Iver or somebody at this point, they're not going to talk about that thing that catapulted them. They're going to talk about sort of the great art of songcraft, or they're sort of chasing something else. And that's the story. I mean, even Taylor Swift is doing this, right? It could have been one and done, and she was very young when she started, but she's still going. So this career, and it can happen on different levels and different layers. So it's also knowing what you need as a creative person and what you need as a human. So I think that, there's you can hope to make all your money off your music, and I think that's a totally valid approach. But it's also okay to sort of take a part-time job or work in an office or any number of other things, because it's not necessarily how you're defining yourself. You define yourself as an artist. You define yourself as chasing this creative pursuit. That's far more important, and that's sustainability to me.
I think the other thing about the internet, these current times with like us promoting our work over the internet, is that like it all feels like it comes and goes very fast. It feels like there's kind of like so much competition for just like eyeballs to kind of see everything.
Right.
So the difference is maybe telling a story that is less about the like, look at this like big great thing that everybody loves, that like has 1,000 views or like has the most amount of streams. Like what does that kind of like marketing look like then for like a sustainable, or like what does that kind of like promotion, self-promotion look like for an artist?
I think, well, a couple things. One is that I think it's sort of, I think it's about your body of work. So I think that you are creating things, you're making things, and you're putting those things into the world. And that cycle in and of itself is where you have control, and then you don't have control. And so to fuss over the things you don't have control over is to sort of drive yourself insane. But to really focus on your craft, and to focus on making something that you're proud of, and to focus on something that communicates the essence of who you are. I think I'm really a big fan of a lot of these artists, like Guided by Voices or Nether Friends. There's this guy, Sean, in LA, who goes by Nether Friends, and he's put out 80 records. I mean, he puts out a record a week. And so he has a process that allows him to sort of purge. And he gets some great songs and has some hits and has some things that work and some things don't. But that's the point. And that's the thing you need to sort of, I think too many people get stuck in their head about perfection. And it's sort of like, I think in Instagram culture too, people will take down posts if they don't get 100 comments. I think people will start to try and focus on how many followers they have or how many likes they get on a thing. And it's a little empty. I think at the end of the day, that stuff comes or it doesn't. But what the question is, if you made something you're proud of, and that are you chasing something that you feel is of your time and worth it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
where do you...
the internet perverts a lot of that for all of us. And so but I think that the backside of that is think first about your community. So your immediate community is your family and your friends, and then the community beyond that, which might be your neighborhood or your the town you live in, and then you sort of build out. And actually, if I think about how things happened when I was younger, that's how it was pre-internet. You didn't just become a global sensation. You played a local show, or you played to two people in the basement, or you played at a church, or whatever it might have been. I think that is just as valid. And those building blocks are how you become, it's how you communicate. I think that it's part of the cycle.
I mean, I was going to ask you where you think this this feeling comes from that I've recognized in myself, but I've also recognized in a lot of my students and other people that I know, that like basically they're just not getting, like they feel like they're doing good work, but they don't feel like they're getting attention. They don't know how to get attention. They don't know, there's a sense of feeling like if people just heard this or just saw kind of what I was doing, they would connect to it. But maybe first of all, is there a way, like, what are some tangible ways to get over that hump? But also, like, where does that feeling come from? Like, I'm sure you've seen that kind of, or you've heard that kind of a thing from people a lot.
I think it's really normal, because I think it's validating in a way, and making work can be really lonely. And I think it's hard to know sometimes where, and you think you've made something that is important for you, and then you put it on Spotify or YouTube or whatever, and nobody cares. It can be a really painful process. But again, if we look at the history of music making and art making, and this has always been going on, and just because something wasn't discovered didn't mean it wasn't great. And how many like uncovered great pop artists of the 1960s people find years and years later. So the trick there is a little bit about community building and being part of something that can help challenge and spur you on. So it's probably really important that you don't create, and a lot of musicians have a tendency to sort of create an isolation instead of bringing work out slowly with their peers. So, the healthiest communities that I've seen in the last 20 years have been the ones in Minnesota or Wisconsin or different places, even Wellington, where I live now, where people have they're challenging each other. And so they're playing to nobody, but their friends are coming out, and then they're making better and better records, and they're sort of seeing each other, but it's a very small thing for a very long period of time. So I think that the introvert extrovert nature of being a performer and a creator and a songwriter need to be balanced out. And you also need to be brave enough to do the thing that might be deeply uncomfortable or painful. But at the same time, you need to build a practice for that. And in the same way, you need to build a practice for vocal techniques. I don't actually know about stuff or scales or whatever it might be. I think you need to also build a practice to sort of go and see other music, go and connect to other communities, take part in a conversation around music and art as well. So it's not just musicians hanging out with musicians. It's also important to be part of a film community and theater community and all the other parts as well.
And we're living in a time when in the US, like all of that has to happen online, basically.
Yeah.
Which is very weird. I mean, can you talk a little bit about, you're living in New Zealand and you've been there for like just about a year, a little over a year, something like that?
About a year. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, so what's it like there? Like how is everybody?
Yeah.
It's this, the country's open basically, right? Like, or the
Well,
country's
the
like,
country is
the country's
closed.
closed, but you're doing normal stuff basically, right?
Yeah. I think that, yeah, it's hard. It's hard to talk about because I don't want to feel like, but it's essentially things are very normal here because there is no coronavirus in New Zealand. But it's actually a really nice reminder of how regional communities work. So New Zealand is a country of 5 million people. Minnesota, where I met you and where I lived previous to this, is a state of 5 million people. And when I think about this, in Finland, where I lived after Minnesota, is a country of 5 million people, right? So, like, essentially within those and these communities, you can kind of understand um, how things like viruses spread and how things can be controlled or not controlled. But it's also comparable to how we think about music and art and other pieces as well. So, like, this notion of Minnesota or New Zealand, as you were. So there's been a lot of musicians touring. So because the community's healthy and you can go and play shows, there's been a lot of New Zealand artists who are now playing local clubs and normally would sell out maybe one night, are now selling out like 5 nights because people want to be part of that. And so we did shut down for a little while and we did go into lockdown for a little while and everybody sort of did the right thing. And now that it comes back, I have a little bit of hope that this will happen in the rest of the world too. People really want connection, to go out, to see friends, to be part of a live show. And so I'm really hoping that the same effect as coronavirus dies down in the US and other places and becomes safe, that we see that same thing start to happen. But yeah, it's been pretty amazing being here. And then it's really made me think about those local communities and then how there's global connections throughout them. So I connect with you and talk to my friends in Iceland and talk to people in Finland, and it starts to feel both comforting and really sort of intimidating how far apart we are, yet how tightly knit the people who do this kind of stuff are. There's not a ton of people who do what we do or operate in this space. So that community becomes more important locally and globally.
Yeah, it's an expanding and shrinking kind of like world for us at the same time.
Right.
So we've talked about the idea that maybe the music industry, or particularly like the live performance aspect of the music industry will especially in the US have to be kind of like rebuilt or like reformed. And what are some of the ways that you would hope maybe that it would be rebuilt better? Like what are some of like the aspirations of, in your experience of being involved, like how can it get better? How should it get better? How maybe will it inevitably improve?
Yeah.
Or
I mean, I really think about the small venues that meant so much to me growing up and maybe meant so much to me, period. The Empty Bottle in Chicago, the Amsterdam Bar and Hall in St. Paul, 7th Street Entry in Minneapolis, like these types of rooms, and seeing young artists get their start in these rooms is really important. The Firehouse in New Haven, Connecticut, like these sort of spaces where people can come together. And I think that there's 2 layers. There's sort of, when you say music industry, I think sometimes we think about like Live Nation and like Bon Jovi. I'm not worried about that. I am really worried about that the stages exist for young artists to continue to hone their craft, make an audience. And I really like that idea. I'm mid 40s now, but I like the idea that there's always something new coming up. And there's sort of this constant churn of new talent and new ideas and new communities that are happening. So it's really vital that we support those places and that we go and donate money to small stages, and that we support artists. We buy merchandise from them, and we sort of, it'd be really good to sort of have new models for doing that. whether that's subscriptions, which I've heard people talk about. You pay a certain price to have baseline access to, all this stuff happens at a very corporate level with major artists, but I think it should happen at a grassroots level. I think it'd be much more meaningful if we supported, and not just musicians, but young filmmakers and young painters and theater and the whole thing, at a much smaller, much more boutique level. Those venues are going to need it coming out of Corona, and they need it now. And I think that that's in the US, but that's also across the world. So my hope is that we start to vote with our wallets in that direction. And there's a bunch of movements around it, and maybe you can put some in the credits of the thing. The Save Our Stages stuff, I think, is really important.
Yeah, definitely. We'll put some links in the comments below. But in my lifetime, there was already kind of, it felt like this, like just the amount of live venues to play at, like had already kind of like almost cratered, like when, by the time I lived in New York in the kind of like early 2000s, there was a sense that like 10% of the jazz clubs or something were still there, like the rest had just kind of disappeared. And this idea that I think so many of like my mentors espoused and like had kind of like used as their way of coming up was this like, touring and being on the road and stuff as like a very young artist, playing like every night of the week. And it was just kind of like, by the time I became a musician that was like old enough to go play shows, it was kind of like I couldn't pay to play every night of the week. It's just and then now it's absolutely nothing. But I also see what people are doing, with streaming and like how easy it is to stream a concert on Instagram and raise a little bit of money that way. I think it's really great. I wonder if, kind of like what you talked about for like young artists, that idea of like trying to get a subscription right away before you've kind of like really done anything, I think is like can be a pretty big ask. But I wonder if there's probably incremental things in between there, just getting someone to follow you on Instagram or something like that, or TikTok seems like a can seem like a big ask, but I think like if you're doing good work, that's one way.
But that's a cycle, and then it just sort of scales up and down. But also, like when we think about the life cycle of music venues in New York City or Chicago or major places that closed and opened and whatever, that was happening long before coronavirus, and also happening in the 70s and the 80s. So that there was and there is a really natural ebb and flow about arts culture in general. And I think sometimes can be very painful, but the corporatization or the capitalistic sort of nature. So there are venues that I think in the 90s and the 2000s, like the Rave in Milwaukee, that was charging bands to play their stages. I really hope that those places, I'm not worried about that venue. I don't know if they continue. I'm not sure that's really a place. The Knitting Factory is absolutely a venue that I care about. And I'm not worried, I guess, long-term about places like the Knitting Factory, because there'll be young artists that continue to make great stuff and legacy artists that will continue to support those places. In the Midwest, if we connect the coast, there's lots in New York, and there's lots on the West Coast. I think that it's a sort of the railroad sort of between that's really important. So making sure you can get from New York to Philly, to Chicago and to Minnesota, and that there's enough stops in between. And I hear what you're saying about subscriptions and building it. I think that's all very important, but also playing house shows and basements and DIY festivals. All those things were still happening as these sort of corporate venues were opening and closing. And that's good news for an artist who's young, because you don't have to play if you're 18 and you have a couple records and you want to go on a road trip with your friends. I think you can play in these tiny little spaces. It existed in the 90s when I was a kid and will exist. And funnily enough, exist in New Zealand as well. There's a club down the street, which is tiny, called the Pyramid Club. which is incredible. And it's exactly like a space from 1997. So there is like always going to be this sort of underground thing happening. And I think that's important to support as well. There's probably no money, there's no economic sort of model there, but it's about audience building. That's also part of this TikTok and Instagram and sort of small exchanges. So the sort of micro transactions that aren't about financial transactions, but they're about time. I think those are just as important. And I think we need to put our hand up and say, hey, I'm making something. What do you think of it? And you start with one. It's okay to be building. I don't think you need to have, again, there's this sort of ugly thing that happened with MySpace where people were obsessed with how many followers you had. It didn't mean anything unless those people cared about you. So 5 people who care about you is better than 50,000 people who really do not care about you or your art. So making real connections with real people and forcing yourself to get out of your comfort zone is the trick. So yeah, sorry, Charlie.
Yeah.
I don't think like, oh, there's no jazz club for me in Milwaukee is a reason not to play Milwaukee. Whether or not those rooms are official or not, I think is kind of okay. And jazz is like a jazz or punk rock or indie rock or whatever. These are sort of countercultural movements, and the counterculture is still there, and that's important. And nowadays, I think that's more important. And I also think on the backside of a politically difficult time, there's going to be a lot of reasons why we need amazing music to lift up the spirits of people. And this happened in the 80s with Reagan. There was a huge movement of filmmakers and artists and Sonic Youth and Ray Pettibone and all these other folks who are making incredible stuff, Minutemen, et cetera. And it was in direct relationship to what was happening politically. And they were playing tiny rooms. So I think this is the same for jazz, the same for folk, the same for whatever today.
Yeah, I mean all the genre stuff is very interesting to me. I think it is almost kind of similar to what you were talking about with like the with like certain kind of clubs coming and going, or these different kinds of things being in vogue. I think even just like what you call your music, or like what community you're kind of part of, is like it can kind of go in these like cyclical waves, where it's like for 10 years or something being whatever, even being like a rock musician or something could like be not cool, and then all of a sudden it's cool again. And it's like, yeah, I've been thinking about this. We're talking about kind of like all these platforms, and you brought up MySpace, and like I've just been thinking so much about how my career kind of feels like this video game, where it's like I'm playing the video game and I'm accruing all of this, like these different random currencies or something, or like ranking up, and like most of it, it's hard to tell which of it matters. Like like, oh, okay, I have 1,000 of these points. Like, what can I do with these points? It's like, oh, nothing. You could make your hair pink or something in the game. And then and then you play the game for a little bit, and then eventually, like, nobody wants to play that game anymore. They all want to play a different game. And then now this game has totally different and like non-transferable currency that it also is like surprisingly meaningless in all these kind of like weird ways. So it's like, you talk about MySpace and like trying to like build up followers, then like MySpace gets deleted. Then it was like, I need to have so many followers on Facebook or something like that. And then it was like, guess what? Facebook is just for old people. And then it was like, well, now we have this other thing. And it's like, now it might be like YouTube or TikTok or whatever the thing is. And it's like, you kind of, I think this is the hard thing about building an audience now, in the way that like it feels like they kind of transfer, but it's hard to tell which ones are like are just kind of like noise or something. Like somebody might have a couple thousand Instagram followers, and it's like, if Instagram stops being cool completely and then we go to some other next thing, how many of those people, how much of that work maybe that you're putting in, and maybe it's just maybe that's just indicative of how life is or something. Like there isn't, I think we envision this kind of like long-term traction, and it's not the same. Like we're the thing that stays the same, not all these kind of like outside triggers or something.
Yeah. I think it's again this sort of idea of validation in a way is troubling, but I think that like if you think about it as connecting, and you also don't put all your hopes and dreams into one platform. I mean, if your process is about becoming a great performer and it's about writing and making great music that fulfills you, whatever that might be, and then it connects to people in a community, and whatever sort of taste making is out there, it doesn't necessarily matter because there's an audience for each one of these genres and ideas. So it might not be something that I'm into. It might not be something that's in vogue, but it connects to somebody. That is what matters. And that's the thing you can control. Then you overlay these other pieces on top of it, and they're tools you can use or not use. And whether or not you're chasing TikTok or obsessing over like getting people to do dances or trying like it, I don't know, and maybe I'm too old, but I don't know if that's how musicians should be spending their time. I think that it's part of or spending their focus, right? So like if you're obsessed with that and you forget about the other piece, then there you got nothing to offer. If you're obsessed with writing a great record and then you're doing the businessy part of the thing, there's a way to do both, but I think you can get trapped. And the zeitgeist and all the different pieces are going to move and change. But then if you're honoring the work that you want to do, then, and chasing the thing, and I've known you for a long time, and how your work has changed and evolved and morphed and sort of absorbed different influences means that you're still progressing on a journey of making better and better art. And you're still connecting, you're making videos, you're doing YouTube and this kind of stuff. If you think about that in the long term, that is this sort of notion of there is continuity there. Even if you didn't do YouTube 5 years ago and you're doing YouTube now. And then, on some level, that's the ecosystem you play within. And it doesn't matter, I don't think, to me, whether or not you, as somebody who I care about and whose work I like, has 40,000 followers or 4,000 followers. And that's an exchange on some level. And then that's all you can control. But if you only make the great work and you don't put it in the world, and if you only have these thoughts inside your head and you don't engage with other people around them, then that's the challenge. And I think there's a lot of people that are doing that. Send your record to people that you don't know. Send it to Pitchfork and journalists and New York Times. Be part of the conversation. Go and see other people play. Pay for subscription services yourself. Comment on videos that you like. And then assume and hope that people will do the same for you. So be part of that dialogue, I think, is my point.
And control like you said, kind of control the things you can control.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, I don't know. I mean, I feel that it can be really disheartening, and I don't know if that's ever not been the case. I don't think it's about now as like a bad time to make music. I think that although coronavirus is, difficult, but I've seen a lot of people really thrive. And it's been interesting, and it will change the landscape forever. But it was always changing anyway. So, but we're still here, I think. I don't know. You might be pre-recorded.
Tell me about XYZ. I mean, I know that we should be wrapping up, but
I'll do this all day.
I think part of this conversation for me, or like, I think where a lot of this comes from, honestly, is this idea that like, okay, listen, you're an artist. You should just be focused on your art. This is how it's always been. It's always been weird and hard for artists. Like, Beethoven wasn't rich or something, or like Charles Ives, like lived in a basement or something. And it's like, okay, cool. That's great. That makes me maybe feel better about not being rich or something, or like not having like a 401k. But then it's like,
Right.
At the same time, I think like artists are getting all this pressure to like, you need to
Yeah.
make a life for yourself. You need to like make money. Like, smart artists are the ones that leverage their work and like get paid for it, and like, oh, you need to learn about the law. You need to be able to like copyright, it's like all this kind of stuff. Like, I think we're hearing both messages. And the message that says, if you do this stuff, you will make money and be like, and have some sense of like security.
Right.
Is a really hard message to like say no to, because it's not just it's coming literally from all angles. Like, it's like your family is saying that like when you decide you're going to be a musician, that's going to be your career. Like you're instantly under a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
And I've given this advice to students before and just said like, hey, this whole idea you have of like musicians being rich and famous or whatever the thing is, and like owning multiple houses, like that's actually not really true. And that's not, I mean, like that does happen, but like, that's not the norm. If you think about like the most famous, like classical musicians of all time, it's like, they're not super duper duper rich, it's like sometimes it's just like, oh, I have my own apartment. Like, this is cool.
Yeah.
And I get to make the weird music that I like, and I don't know what the question is in all of this. It's just, I'm feeling like this whole chat is me being like, yeah, but I'm like feeling really bummed out about all this. And you're like, well, you just need to like look at it differently. And like, or like, I recognize that you're feeling weird, but also like, there is hope. And I do believe there is hope, but even before the pandemic, like this was like a very hard kind of thing to figure out. It continues to be a very hard thing to figure out.
Yeah. But this is why, and I don't think that what you're saying or asking is unreasonable. And I think it is hard. And a lot of things are hard, and that's why it's meaningful. So I think that, if it was easy and, a musician, cool, and I just do that thing and I have a TikTok and I do a funny dance and it's okay, it wouldn't be any good. And, like, I think that what we're trying to chase is meaning, and just behind that is joy. And it might not be easy to get to either of those things. And so that while you're pursuing it, you need to reach out and freak out. And that's really normal. So if you're not able to sort of necessarily understand how to book a tour or deal with copyright stuff, I think that makes sense. So then there are people you can talk to about that, and then you could do research or you could be part of it. But I there's no clear path for anybody around anything. And I think if we pretend otherwise, it's irresponsible. And I don't know if anybody's career is repeatable business. So we can't say like, oh, I'm going to do what Bon Iver did, because I don't think that's something that everybody can do. But S. Carey, who's part of that Bon Iver crew, is making incredible records. I don't know him, but I think that I'm excited about what he does. And he's part of a community. And I think maybe the grounding advice that I could give almost anybody, carte blanche, is to say, be part of a community and continue to chase that thing that is meaningful to you. And that could be whatever. And some days are good and some days are bad. And coronavirus makes, I think the whole world is really struggling to find connections. So that means that as musicians and as sort of canaries in the coal mine for emotion and feeling, I'm not part of that, but you're
part
more
of it.
Vital
you're in the club.
Well, I'm in the club.
You're in the club.
But more vital than ever. I care more about music today than ever. And when I'm able to go outside and listen to songs or hear new music or the new Fleet Foxes record or whatever, it is so powerful to me in a time where I really need hope. And so I think that somewhere in that exchange is why I'm ultimately not worried about it's not about the celebrity thing and the TikTok thing. It's fine. It's like kind of a one trick pony though. This other thing is really what I'm interested in. And it's a pursuit that you've since I've known you've been chasing. And many of the students who you and I worked with a few years ago are still chasing, but actually they've moved on and they're further into, and they're doing great stuff. And I have tons of cases, but if we had told them that 10 years ago, I don't know if any of them, would have necessarily understood what we were saying, and they just have continued. And so maybe the final piece of advice that I would give anybody is don't stop. Keep going. Keep chasing this thing. Whether or not it's easy is not the point. That feels, yeah. I think I stand by almost everything I said.